what is really S&P's warning and how it must be read into, especially at a time when the finance minister has chosen to reject that, saying while we are aware of our own shortcomings, plenty is already on track. That is the finance minister's take as he rejects the S&P warning and arguments. But let's get down to the bottom of this discussion with Sajid Chinoy, who's the India economist at JP Morgan, and Vivek Debroy, who's the professor at Center for Policy Research. Thank you, gentlemen. Sajid, I'll start with you. Really the question that S&P has put out the red flags, and they're pretty much on the lines of what it highlighted early in April. But the FM says, hang on, we don't agree with you.
Yeah, well, at some level, none of this is new information, right? This is exactly what S&P said back in April, which is to say that you may get caught in a vicious cycle of low growth, high fiscal deficits, an unsustainable current account deficit, which then feeds into itself. Low growth makes the fiscal consolidation harder. If you have fiscal slippage, that vitiates investor sentiment further. That could put more pressure on the rupee, and you get stuck in a vicious cycle. So none of what they've said today, I think, is new information. It reiterates what they've said 2 months ago. I guess the concern maybe is that we're approaching the end of one quarter of the new fiscal year, and we've seen no progress on any of these fronts. There's been nothing on rationalizing energy prices, nothing to convince anyone that the fiscal consolidation is on track. I think that's what is a source of concern, that weeks and months pass, but we haven't sort of caught the bull by the horns to try and improve sentiment.
Exactly. Okay, catch the bull by the horns, and there's not been enough action over the last few months since the time S&P earlier raised those red flags. That is Sajid Chinoy's point. Professor Debroy, do you believe S&P's downgrade threat is justified in these economic times?
Well, yes, a little bit. Although the last time round, S&P had indicated that they were going to downgrade the ratings. One should not make too much out of an S&P rating. It's just one of the several signals that are floating around. But to be charitable to S&P, I would say that in the weeks that have passed since the last time S&P did the rating, has anything positive really happened? Not quite. In fact, there are many more negative signals coming around. So although I do think that it's premature, I can understand why S&P has done it.
Okay, you're saying you agree that it's premature. Professor Debroy, what could be the trigger for the statement coming out of S&P? You know, the fisc hasn't really deteriorated in the last 2.5 months. Is it just the Q4 GDP figure that has made S&P take note and come out with the statement?
I think it's a little bit premature, because whatever negative signals were floating around were already known earlier. There's only one thing that I can discern as having deteriorated, and that is there was all this talk about the Prime Minister getting his act together and doing something on infrastructure. I never expected much to happen from this, but the fact of the matter is, after that meeting was held, nothing very much transpired. So I'm prepared to believe that people had unrealistic expectations about what is going to happen, and because they did not happen, it sort of reinforced the negative sentiments that were floating around.
Sajid Chinoy, even as we give the government a fair amount of stick for policy inaction, do you also smell a bias here against a developing country like India? How else can one justify our rating vis-a-vis Spain, which actually enjoys a higher rating than India?
Yeah. You know, I think it's not very productive to get into that argument about whether there's a bias or not. I don't think any of these steps need to be taken just because we have to prove to S&P that we meet their ratings credentials. I think we have to take these steps because we have to boost growth in India. And boosting growth means reducing the very high levels of macroeconomic uncertainty and macroeconomic instability. And that entails credible fiscal consolidation. That entails ensuring that the exchange rate begins to stabilize. So I don't think we should take these steps to prove a point to anybody. This should be done regardless, because these are necessary prerequisites to crowd in private investment, without which it will be very hard to go back to the pre-crisis growth levels.
Right, but that's a totally different argument, isn't it, Sajid? The point that one should not take this bias or not is one issue, but the fact that we need to do our job and on track, that's a totally different point. Now, Professor Debroy, do you agree with Sajid out there? We shouldn't have a bias, or do you think S&P does indeed have one, given how quickly they're coming back to remind India about these red flags?
One does not, and certainly insofar as the ratings of all of these rating agencies are concerned, There is a market bias in favor of the developed countries and a market bias against the developing countries. We know that to be a fact of life. And the rating agencies haven't exactly covered themselves with glory in the period before 2007-2008. That's the reason one should not blow this up out of all proportion. Although any such rating also impacts the private sector, because the private sector finds it a little bit more difficult to borrow.
Of course it does. Why not? And given that they are all the time looking at working despite the government, aren't they? A quick reminder to our viewers to participate in this very discussion as we bring you a complete discussion play out even on Twitter. The question trending tonight is the S&P downgrade threat to India justified? If you agree, then why? On your screen are our Twitter handles. Professor Debroy, I want to just come back to you on the very issue, whether or not you feel that this is really a good wake-up call, and perhaps second time in 3 months, but indeed time for the government to act now, because we don't have a very long haul ahead of us given elections and a populist mode setting in.
No, I don't think one should look at S&P. If I were the government, I would be much more worried about the growth numbers. And if the government was going to do something, it would have done something on the basis of the growth numbers. And immediately after the growth numbers happened, there were two things that were reported in the media. First, that the Prime Minister was going to take stock of whatever was happening on infrastructure. And secondly, there were reports to the effect that the Congress party had instructed the government that some action should be taken. The fact remains, however, that nothing has materialized in concrete terms. So not S&P, but there are plenty of signals floating around that the figures are pretty dismal. And in addition, now we have some job growth figures which tend to show that job growth has also been deteriorating. So independent of the rating agencies, there are a lot of reasons why the government should actually get its act together now.
Sajid, now let's also look at the S&P statement in closer detail, because contrary to what everyone else has been saying, that it's the allies who are to be blamed for the state of affairs, S&P says it's the political leadership, specifically the fact that we have a leadership structure wherein the Prime Minister has very little say. It's the Congress President who largely runs the government, and that is one of the key reasons why reforms aren't happening.
Yeah, well, I think, any onlooker on the Indian economy will recognize that politics and political constraints over the last couple of years have been critical in stymieing reform. I mean, I think it's well known that there were efforts underway to try and rationalize energy prices. That came into political trouble. We all know about the fact that FDI into multi-brand retail was introduced last November, had to be rolled back. So it's no secret, really, that politics has been very critical in stymieing reform. The hope is, and the question is, the window to do things is getting very narrow. 2013 is the last year before the general election. Next year's budget will be the last budget before the election. And chances are, if difficult, politically sensitive decisions are not made this year, the likelihood of these happening in 2013 are even lower. So I think what everyone's really hoping for is now is the window, perhaps between now and February, when the next budget takes place. And if we do not take advantage of this window, the likelihood of big things happening between now and 2014 are very, very low. And which is why I think the call to action that hopefully today's statement again will push the government to is critical in the next few quarters.
Okay, it's a call for action. Sajid, all eyes are also now on the Reserve Bank of India. The markets are already pricing in a rate cut. But the big question, will a rate cut solve the fundamental problem that the S&P has pointed out?
I don't believe so. I firmly believe that this is not a monetary problem. If it was a monetary problem, we would have had some reaction from the 50 basis point cut in April. The fact is that one of the key reasons why investment has ground to a halt is there are real implementation issues on the ground. If you look at the number of projects that have started but actually stalled or been scrapped, that ratio has doubled over the last year and quadrupled over the last 3 or 4 years. The number of projects that are being completed on the ground has fallen by more than a half over the last 4 quarters. None of that has to do with interest rates. So I think easing some of the supply constraints on the ground, land acquisition, coal availability, environmental clearances, S&P spoke about the POSCO project, those will go much farther in trying to boost investor sentiment and injecting a pickup in the capex cycle than will a 25 or 50 basis point cut in rates.
So that's one important point. Professor Debroy, do you agree with that? Is an RBI rate cut probably not going to be that much of a game changer for the economy as any policy move towards reform, particularly domestic issues like land, environment and so on?
I don't think it will. Firstly, for the rate cut to be significant, to be effective, it has to be significant enough. I do not think 25 basis points are going to make a difference one way or the other. Even 50 basis points won't make much of a difference. But the right issue, as you said, is that it's not so much interest rates. It is a fact that people are not investing today, and the reasons they are not investing are known, and they have little to do with monetary policy. So yes, one would like the interest rate cuts, but taken in isolation, the interest rate cuts are not going to help all that much.